All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. I'm here with a guest who is new to the show and relatively new to me. I think that, as I told you, sort of when we first started talking, I like to go through Bandcamp and find anything tagged with Winnipeg. And your record was one of the records that I found, and I made a mental note like I should reach out to this person and see if he wants to be on the show. And then, as luck would have it, you reached out to me, so it worked out. But I think the best way to start this off, because you have a very extensive history as a musician and as a music educator and all these different roles. If you want to introduce yourself and just give a Cole's Notes kind of background about what you've done as an artist and what you do now.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun. Yeah, my name is Ben Reimer, and I'm from here in Winnipeg. Spent a lot of time kind of back and forth between here and Montreal since about the mid 90s.
Okay.
And I'm a drummer and a percussionist. And I guess what I'm mostly known for these days is my particular approach to the drum kit, which is kind of been focusing on in the last 15 years or so, which has been to work with composers who are interested in writing fully composed works for the instrument, so notated pieces, and performing as a soloist or playing with like an orchestra in a concerto setting in a concert hall or in operas or like different chamber music, experimental stuff with videos and that sort of thing, but sort of taking the drum kit from where we know what we kind of generally associate it to be a part of as like a timekeeper in
Yeah.
bands and in sort of at a massive sort of voice within popular music in as a whole over the last 100 years or so, but not so much as a classical, instrument is for it's a horrible word to use, but bringing it into that setting a little bit and exploring the potential of that, and sort of
Yeah.
through that, I've developed some important relationships with composers and also ensembles that have kind of allowed me to tour around the world and make some records and things and play this instrument and a bunch of other percussion as well. But yeah.
Well, I'm glad you kind of brought up the concept of taking the drums away from what people sort of assume they are as an instrument, because I think that that's the idea of, I know you said classical is kind of a not the best word for it, but
Yeah.
a drum set in that context, just in the first place, I think to a lot of people is kind of a surprise or kind of something they don't expect. They expect percussion, but having a full drum set in classical music or in composed pieces in general, it is really seen by a lot of people, I think, as maybe not strictly just a timekeeper, but as this kind of integral part of the rhythm section that isn't necessarily doing anything aside from the occasional fill or solo that is necessarily more in depth than that, really.
Yeah, and I mean it's a tough like if you go into the traditions of drummers through recorded history, we can't even begin to discuss the amount of players that
Of
go
course,
way beyond
of course.
anything that we could even imagine that humans could do with the instrument. There's such intellect and um, uh, yeah, and brilliance with so many decades and decades and decades of players. But yeah, we don't associate it with the world of sort of Western classical. What a lot of times we talk about contemporary music or new
Yeah.
music. Like we just had the New Music Festival. These sort of modern composers. Um, yeah, so we don't associate it with that. But what's interesting is the drum kit since even the 20s or so, 1920s, has been incorporated into orchestras by like French composers like Darius Milhaud. Stravinsky kind of drew from interesting elements of the instrument, but a lot of times you could pretty much call that appropriation because they're
Okay.
basically using the instrument to represent a style. And in Europe in the 20s, they were obsessed with jazz
Sure.
as sort of this kind of way to free themselves from composers before them. So they would bring in people to play kit, and write for this instrument to sort of reflect this style. And that can be kind of problematic. And so it was trying to find, and I've been fortunate enough to, in this day and age to work with composers that have backgrounds not just in classical composition, but they're metalheads. They're
Yeah,
obsessed with, like every other genre, and they understand the relevance and the deep history of the instrument. And that's been the kind of like the that has to be at the core of it when you take it into this context of classical music. Let's say it only really works to the fullest degree when the people that are all involved, the composers and everybody, also understand where this instrument comes from
for
and
sure.
and the history of it. Yeah,
Well, and I think that it's interesting too because I've definitely listened to music that has very, very complex drumming and
yeah,
percussion, and definitely has. I mean, you mentioned jazz a few minutes ago. I think that's one of the genres where drummers have kind of been given leeway to just go off and sort of reinterpret what people expect to hear out of the instrument. And I mean, metal as well. You get some really extreme stuff where the drums are at the forefront and they're doing things that most people don't even realize you can do at the speeds and the intensity and everything like that. But I guess like for you, what was the introduction to taking drums into this direction? Because I assume I might be wrong, but I assume you got into drums the same way most people do play the instrument, which is listening to music where it's a little bit more straight ahead and a little bit more sort of the expected way that drums are meant to be played.
yeah. I got into music. I'm obsessed with music because of, well, I'm obsessed with music because of drums, and I'm also obsessed with drums because of just diving into music and my older brothers and sisters, giving me Unforgettable Fire, and me like hearing Larry Mullen Jr. and U2 for the first time, and then hearing, I won't even get into everybody, but yeah, through recorded music
Yeah,
and through the drum kit, that's where I fell in love with being a performer and a musician. Um, and then I got oddly interested in like wanting to play timpani and marimba and all that kind of stuff, and playing in the setting of chamber music where you're
okay,
working with conductors and other musicians. That really fascinated me and felt like something I wanted to be a part of. But there was this sort of um, separation between this instrument that basically made me the listener and the player and the lover of music that I was as a young adult or whatever, and then this world of academia and classically trained performers, that these two places did not coexist. And the drummers that I did know that were in these settings, like I went to McGill for my undergrad, and there's the jazz department, and
sure,
those were the drummers, and then there was the classical department, and that was us that were training to be play in orchestras, and but there was no sort of crossing of those two, and that was just the sort of the reality. So I started to lose touch with this instrument that as a kid I played in bands, and in my early adult life I was touring around with different groups in Winnipeg, um, and so there was kind of a point sort of in the late like 2005 or so where I was fed up with turning down a touring gig or like a night at the King's Head or something, playing the
yeah,
drum kit, because I needed to take the symphony gig, and because it was a union musician's pay,
sure, sure,
and started thinking like, why can't I play drum kit in context of these chamber groups and work with composers? And so I started doing commissioning, where asking composers to write for me, and working with like applying to Manitoba Council, Arts
yeah,
Council, things like that, and just to kind of slowly start to try to integrate the two. And I was living in Winnipeg at that time, and a great organization, Groundswell, that puts on like the new music
yeah,
series every
yeah.
year, has for many, many decades. They started programming and letting me premiere works for drum kit and electronics, and all of a sudden it was, oh, this can actually coexist in this realm of this. Yeah, I guess I keep on going back to the classical music just because it's the most clear.
It works though, right? I mean, it definitely
Yeah,
defines a really broad set,
yeah,
a set of
yeah.
genres of music. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
The trouble is, like, I now that I'm back in Winnipeg, I'm subbing with the symphony and going back to that role a lot, and I love it. But I I also see a big difference between my practice and that tradition. So
sure.
using that word sometimes throws me a little bit, but it, yeah.
Well, one thing that kind of just to talk about your record, the Katana of Choice record,
Yeah.
that was the one that I discovered on Bandcamp, and the reason that it kind of twigged my interest was because first of all, the description that it's for a drum kit, and again, I'm making the assumption that drums are limited where they're obviously not, but just the sort of, and this is for lack of the technical knowledge of what you're doing, but it's so much more melodic than I think a lot of people would expect out of drums because there is this assumption that it's just keeping time. It's strictly a rhythm instrument. It can't, but it obviously can. I mean, like there's so much more kind of depth to it that in listening to that record, it comes very clear that you can. The drums are as evocative as any other instrument when they're
Mm.
used in a certain way. So how do you I imagine that writing. I mean, I know you said you've been working with the composers too, but just coming up with melodic pieces on drums has got to be a different sort of mindset than approaching it from a piano or a guitar or any of the more sort of traditionally melodic instruments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, you're not dealing with set pitches,
Right.
and if I played it on this kit and then was in a somewhere else and with a back line or something, it's going to sound you know fairly different.
Yeah, they won't be tuned the same way and
Or
everything,
another
right?
player plays it, and that's the other thing. Like everybody's touch is so different. Um, but like that melodic element, like for me, my first introduction was probably from my drum teacher back when I was a kid, who played me Max Roach,
Okay.
the drum solo. The drum also waltzes, where he plays in this 3/4 ostinato kind of repeating pattern with his feet, and just plays these lines, um, just yeah, improvises over top, but has these clearly melodic themes that are happening through the toms and things like that, and
Yeah,
that has it
it's been
exists.
there.
And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, Jack Dejournette does an amazing job with using cymbals, and um, Neil Peart.
Oh,
I think he's a very melodic drummer, but he's also using a massive kit.
yeah.
But and I won't get into Neil Peart because I could talk.
Well, his kit's about the size of my house, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, most of like 'cause what I'm doing is I'm really translating what's being written. Like I'm not an improviser.
Okay.
My love is to have a relationship with a composer. Like the album title Katana of Choice, that track was written by Nicole Lizet,
Okay.
who I've been
You've
working
worked with
with.
before, right? There's looking
Oh,
at
for
your discography
for a
there.
very
Yeah.
long time. Yeah. And she comes from such a massive background of being like into 80s metal and things, and now writes for Kronos Quartet or San Francisco Symphony, and has
Yeah.
had things in BBC and everything. Um, but she works with this idea of sort of extending the palette of the drum kit into a melodic area by bringing in actual melodic instruments. So,
Right.
like in that piece, I'm hitting a guitar, a glockenspiel, and sometimes she inserts those instruments, those melodic elements, into the role of like where a snare drum normally would be kind of on, in a rhythmic sense, but also now there's a pitched replacement
Right.
inside. So it's
Right.
kind of expanding it. Yeah.
Do those, do those pieces on that record, do they work the same way live? Like, is there a lot of overdubbing on that, or is that strictly something you can perform uh,
I
in person?
Yeah, I can perform it in person. That particular piece, which is all of side two,
Right.
when we first performed it, it was just me and the percussion quartet Torque, who are on the album. When we did the recording, we used a click track just to sort of lock things in, but we still did it live. I didn't
Okay.
do any. I may have done like smallest little things of overdubs, but all
Right.
live. Yeah.
So I guess you have the kind of the joint responsibility with some of this type of stuff, where you're doing something melodic and you're also doing that basic keeping time thing. I mean, you're still playing drums in the
Yeah.
traditional sense while also doing this on top of that. Is that, do you have to split your brain like into different parts to focus on the different elements, or does it all just kind of come naturally at this point to you?
Uh, Not at first. I think at first, again, if we're going back to the Nicole Lizet piece, but pretty much any of them, the rhythmic aspect you can always trace back to, like there's a shuffle, and I hear Steve Gadd or I hear Bernard Purdy, or
Okay.
like there's a paradiddle groove, and and I can think of like 50 Ways to Leave a Lover, these tunes, and with composers that have that background in popular music, and they're writing for the drum kit. Yeah, you'll see like, oh, this is a blast beat, but this is a blast beat being played at like pianissimo. So
Right. Right.
so you're kind of in this weird context, but you have to first kind of draw from history and from the language of the instrument, and then figure out how to do it in the context of these strange sort of extended techniques. So
Right.
that was like when I went back to do I went back to Montreal in 2010 for a doctorate, and it was really, I just needed time to work on technique again. Now that I was seeing the possibilities of the instrument, I wanted to be able to play double kicks, and I wanted, but I wanted to be able to play them at the quietest volume and do crescendos or play quintuplets, and control things in ways that I was starting to see that composers, and particularly Nicole Izay, that I keep coming back to because
Yeah.
just the amount of music that we've done together. Um, I was seeing these techniques that I lacked, and wanted to sort of refine. Yeah, but you have to know where the stuff comes from, and then place it within the sort of the new language.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. So having a background where you have listened to metal and jazz and all of these different styles and pop music and everything, that all kind of helps build up the vocabulary of playing these kind of pieces.
yeah, absolutely. And for me, I find that like there are other people playing, and there's more drum kit within this context of notated music. And
Right.
as a teacher in university, after I finished the doctorate, I was teaching at McGill, and some of my students were starting to want to learn some of this stuff. And not everyone can approach it the same way. And the trick is, once it starts moving into this world of percussion performance, not everyone has the same depth of background.
Right.
So I found it kind of my job as a teacher, kind of coaching people in this rep, was to sort of encourage them, like, okay, have you listened to I don't know what, like Meshuggah, or like let's listen to some blast beats, and like I'm going to give you some exercises on it, because not everybody comes from all of that.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
So you get kind of protective of it, because it's like, you don't understand, you don't listen to Steely Dan, and, and I don't know, it's tricky. Yeah.
What is that like? I guess as a teacher, knowing you're introducing people who maybe have spent their whole life in the classical academic kind of world, and then here's a blast beat. Like, what does that feel like to start introducing them to something that is so far potentially out of their like realm of knowledge of music?
Yeah, mostly it's awesome. Yeah, and they're so excited too, and I'm teaching now a little bit at just a few students at the University of Manitoba, and and they know my background, so we go from working on some four mallet technique on marimba to them wanting to develop their feet on drum kit, and yeah, getting having people sort of know that they have that option with me is really rewarding. Yeah.
Cool, cool. So with all the stuff that you have going on right now, I mean, you're teaching. You said you're sitting in with the symphony. You have all these different projects on the go. What is sort of your plan going forward? I mean, that record that we've been talking about was released a few years ago. I know
Yeah.
you've been involved in many other projects before and since, but sort of what is the next big plan for you? Do you have another project that you're sort of working towards?
I've actually, I've sort of, I'm kind, like many people during the pandemic, we all sort of started to, kind of look at things.
Yeah.
And my partner and I, we moved back to Winnipeg during that time, and we were pretty burnt. And I've talked to a lot of drummers here and also back in Montreal that like kind of were just sort of relieved at that point to not be
Yeah.
just hustling for gigs and traveling and stuff. So part of my goal now has been to actually sort of be a little bit more grounded. I've actually wanted to get back to just playing the kit as like, so I'm playing in a metal band
Right on.
that we're writing some new songs. We're called Death Forge.
Good name.
There's a few videos I think on YouTube. We're just kind of getting things sorted, but just like playing the instrument as the instrument within the context that I grew up and loved, and
Yeah,
playing in a top 40 cover band called 10 Years On that plays at playing at the King's Inn a couple Saturdays.
right on.
Um, so getting back to some of that, and then I have some sort of bigger projects. Another Nicole Lizet sort of online multimedia piece. I'm going to be
Oh,
going
cool.
out to Austin, Manitoba, where my actually my partner's from. Her family has a farm there, and I'm going to be doing some double kicks on farm equipment and hay bales,
That's
and
awesome.
recording some stuff that's going to be turned into a piece that she's making. The quartet that I brought you a record of, I
Yeah.
think, Architect Percussion. I'm going to be touring with them in Norway and Sweden and
Oh, wow.
things like that in the early fall. So some kind of long term things like that. But
And
right now, very focused in Winnipeg, and yeah,
is that group based out of Quebec? Do I have that right?
yeah. They're from Montreal. I met them all at McGill. They were studying at the same time that I
Oh,
was.
cool. Okay.
Yeah,
So you have a lot on the go, obviously, which is great. I mean, I think you're right about the pandemic. A lot of people who were playing shows constantly or constantly writing or whatever, they kind of took it as an opportunity to, whether it's focused on one thing or just get that downtime that
yeah,
maybe they haven't had from a decade of straight touring. And it's like
yeah.
this enforced break, but actually a useful one.
Oh yes, absolutely. Um, yeah, it just kind of gives you a chance to sort of refocus a little bit, and um, yeah, I learned to scratch. I got some turntables. I've always wanted to mix, doing
Yeah.
just being just pure fun for a little while that isn't based on a contract or something. It was really lovely.
Well, I was
I'm
gonna ask.
embarrassed to have said that last part though.
No, no, no. Well, you have a DJ side gig, right?
Yeah, I sometimes I go by Sankaset, DJ Sankaset, and during the pandemic, pretty much every Friday for 2 years, and then actually it's kind of slowed down because I haven't had time since real world things have been back. But
Yeah.
yeah, would do a set with my friends and just chat, and it was all theme based, so every week was a different theme, and I have a pretty big record collection, so it was kind of a chance to just like reflect on the music I have in my home.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
At this point, the good thing about this being a podcast is someone could hear it the day it comes out. They could hear it a year from now. What's the
Mhm.
best way to find out what you're doing as far as maybe potential performances or where people can hear your music that's already out?
Right. These days I'm mostly focused on just I post things pretty regularly on social media. On Instagram is a
Yep.
great way to just connect with me, which is Ben Reimer. Uh, but I have a website, benreimer.com. I've been really horrible about updating it, but you can get all my links, to social
Yeah.
media there too. And for a while, I was really pumping out some drum videos on YouTube.
I saw some of
Uh,
those. I was watching some of those.
yeah, I
Yeah.
was I was doing once a week. I was doing a drum cover, and then again, just work, which I'm so grateful for,
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, being able to work in the city is wonderful. But yeah, I got lazy on the drum covers. But you can find me on YouTube as well if you just search Ben Reimer. Yeah,
Awesome. And then
yeah.
like we said at the beginning, you have kind of this extensive list of credits on records that are your own or groups you've been in or playing with other people. Is the website the best place to find that kind of discography?
Yeah, it's all there. You could go to Bandcamp as well, and it's all there. I even have like the '90s, the lanes. I have like digital, copies of that stuff up there. But you can buy my record, yeah, on Bandcamp if you just search
Awesome.
Ben Reimer. Yeah,
Awesome. Cool.
yeah. Thank you.